Well, welcome everyone to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison, the chair of the Rev 250 Advisory Group, and our guest today is Stephen Park, who is the Director of Academic Technology at Wheaton College, the one in Illinois. But for our purposes, he is the author of The Burning of His Majesty's Schooner Gaspee, an attack on the crown rule before the American Revolution. And this year is the 250th anniversary of the burning of the Gaspee. So thanks for joining us, Steve.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Bob.
Now, I know if you are in Rhode Island, you know all about the Gaspee, but for those who are not so blessed, could you just give us a very brief overview of what the burning of the Gaspee is all about?
Sure. So in the frequent telling of the history of the American Revolution, many authors have gone right from the 1770 Boston Massacre to the 1773 Boston Tea Party. And it's a very Massachusetts-centered story. And some historians have actually referred to this as the lull, that there's a lull in between those two incendiary events where nothing happened, right?
Yes.
So Rhode Islanders are always quick to remind us that what woke people up from the lull wasn't the Boston Tea Party, it was the Gaspee Affair. And that may have actually emboldened people to see a very weak administrative response from Whitehall and say to themselves, wow, look what we can get away with a very weak response from London and from the London government. And so it really emboldened people. So long story short, at the end of the 7 Years' War, the French, what we call the French and Indian War, in 1763, as there was, increases in taxes in order to try to put 10,000 soldiers in forts along the Appalachian Ridge to keep the Indians in Indian country and keep the Anglos closer to the coast. And included in those tax increases to pay for those 10,000 soldiers was between 20 and 27 vessels were going to be off the coast of the Atlantic. So that's the maritime piece of it. And 5 or 6 of those vessels were small schooners that would be able to get in pretty close to land and go into pretty shallow waters. And so some sloops and some schooners. And they gave them French names after the recent conquest of French Canada. So things like the St. Lawrence, the Madeline, and then, of course, the Gaspee after Gaspee Peninsula. So these vessels, so the Gaspee was not new to the fleet in 1772. It had been serving off the coast for some time. The thing that changed in January of 1772 is Admiral Montague up in Boston ordered Lieutenant Dunningston, the commander of the Gaspee, to go right deep into Narragansett Bay and to really tamp down on smuggling. And whether it was a concern over the smuggling of rum, as we have long assumed it to be, or even the trafficking in human beings in slave trafficking. That's what we really need to get at the bottom of, and that's what we need to dig deeper on as we look at this. But whatever they were concerned about, they were concerned about smuggling. So by February, Dunningston had stopped the vessel, the Fortune, owned by the very powerful Green family. And you recognize Green's name from the Nancy Green. But this was actually Jacob Green's vessel.
Okay.
And so it was condemned, and they were setting a date for a hearing in Boston to get his rum brought before an admiralty court in Boston in March. And it started a very caustic exchange of letters back and forth between Lieutenant Dunningston and Admiral Montague and the Governor Wanton, who was a democratically elected governor of Rhode Island. Connecticut and Rhode Island both had democratically elected governors, not a royal governor, and started a caustic exchange of harsh letters back and forth to the extent that Admiral Montague brought another vessel down, the Beaver, to help protect the Gaspee. That's how concerned he was for their safety.
Really?
And so he brought another vessel down in April. And by May, he made another warning saying, don't go ashore. That's how dangerous Rhode Island is, warning the officers not to go ashore and to protect each other. So then in June, on June 9th, when the Gaspee and the Beaver separated and parted company for a short time, the Gaspee, as you know, sailed up the Providence River about 6 miles south of Providence and ran aground at what we now call Gaspee Point, Namquid Point. Back then, the Indian word was Namquid, and they were stuck there. And so the men got out and they started scraping barnacles off the bottom. It was a hot day. They were in shallow water. They tried to get the vessel unstuck, and they couldn't get it unstuck.
It was
And
just an accident that brought them ashore?
that's the way Dunningston tells the story. It was an
Okay.
accident. He didn't have his local pilot on board,
Right.
didn't realize how shallow it was. The way the Patriots told the story many decades later is that he was lured aground by a small vessel called the Hannah. And so that's the other question we want to know. What might have been on the Hannah? Was he actually pursuing the Hannah? That's the way the Patriots tell the story. In Dunningston's court-martial, there's no mention of the Hannah.
I see.
But in
So
any
let me
case,
just, I know you're telling the story and you're probably going to get to this, but you're the expert. So was it lured aground or was it an accident in your judgment?
yeah, so I do believe he was pursuing the Hannah. I believe that's an honest telling. The $64,000 question, of course, now we need to look deeper into the Hannah.
Right.
Were there human slaves on, were there enslaved people on the Hannah? So now that we look at the Brown family and we look at the extent to which the Brown family was involved in human trafficking, this is an important question for historians. And this is what a new generation of historians is asking.
Right.
So that's another question.
Okay.
So here we are on June 9th, that evening, and a boy starts beating a drum on near Fenner's Wharf in Providence, right there by Sabin's Tavern, which is their traditional sound to call the militia.
Right.
Men start to gather in Sabin's Tavern. They start melting down some bullets, and they have a few drinks. And maybe somewhere around 8 pulling boats that may have held about 8 to 10 men rowed out to the Gaspee. And then somebody claiming to be the sheriff, claiming to have an arrest warrant, which this was a fairly standard formula. When you get stuck like this and you can't solve a problem and something sort of stuck, like these guys were stuck, is to get an arrest warrant and form a posse to put together a small crowd, or you might call them a mob, depending on one's perspective. A crowd and a mob is always sort of confusing.
If they have a warrant from the sheriff, I guess it's
a crowd, right? It's a legitimate posse, right? And this is a legitimate way the 18th century British Americans solved problems.
But they're going to go and arrest Duddingston and the crew?
So they're heading out to arrest Duddingston, and it may have been Buckland. It seems like Buckland, the way the story's told, perhaps overreacted and shot Duddingston before they had a chance to. And it appears he had a sword with him, but didn't actually have a gun. And so as when young people talk to me about this, they're like, well, even if he was a bad cop, doesn't he deserve his day in court? And I'm like, right, you don't just shoot somebody. He deserves his day in court. He didn't get his day in court. They just shot him. But he survived. And not only did he survive into old age. He survived his court-martial and continued to be promoted in His Majesty's Navy and went on to serve in the Napoleonic Wars. He came back and served in North America, and then I believe he made it all the way to Rear Admiral. So it didn't hurt his career at all. No. But in any case, Duddingston was shot and wasn't sure he was going to survive the night. The reason why I think the fire was on purpose, Bob, is they put all the men ashore. Right. If the fire had been an accident, they wouldn't have had the foresight to so carefully evacuate everybody. Nobody got hurt. Everybody,
So this mob or crowd goes, they shoot Duddingston and they burn the ship.
And then the next day, nobody knows anything. Just a huge silence, right? And the silence lasts for decades, right? And so nobody in Rhode Island can say anything. Nobody saw anything. Nobody knew anything. And so it was left to a small, somewhat eccentric Baptist minister in Boston at Second Baptist Church to preach a Thanksgiving Day sermon months later. And he's the one who really makes this thing go viral, right? He's the one who really all of a sudden gets everybody all worked up about the Commission of Inquiry, the Royal Commission of Inquiry, gets everybody all worked up that these guys are going to get sent back to England for a trial, and isn't this unjust? So he mentions the Gaspee 7 times in his sermon. And
so let's just back up.
Sure.
Okay,
sure.
Steve. So there's you said nothing really happens in Rhode Island, but does Montague take any notice of this, and British officials back in London take notice?
Yes, you're right. I got ahead of myself, didn't I? So let's back up for a minute. So by almost right away, Governor Wanton and Deputy Governor Darius Sessions put up a 100-pound reward for any information leading to anybody's arrest. And they post that. And that's right away. So they need to look like they're zealous in finding the perpetrators. By the end of August, the Crown gets word of this. The news travels back to London. And by the end of August, they pass under the royal seal a £500 reward for any information. And then they also form a royal commission of inquiry to investigate. So it's an investigative committee. It doesn't have the ability to arrest anybody. It doesn't have the ability to send anybody back to London. But that isn't how it makes it into its way into the popular media, right? That's not how it got translated. And so that's early September. You can see that document in the state archives. I saw it last month. It's great. Yeah, you can see the King's royal seal there, and over on 33 Broad Street at the state archives. And so that's where it stands. The committee investigates a lot of people. But what Governor Wanton does, the governor of Rhode Island, so cleverly, is he never has the perpetrators and the witnesses in Colony House at the same time on the same day.
Oh, wow.
They never pass in the hallway. They never get to see each other. He carefully questions one group of people, sends them home, brings in the next group of people, questions them, sends them home. And so it really looks like he's helping to obstruct justice. And this comes out in my book. The 19th century historians certainly did not emphasize this. They emphasized that Wanton was zealous to find the truth and that he remained loyal to the crown. And when the revolution came, he stepped down as governor because he was loyal to the crown. And but it's clear when you look at the timing of this thing that Wanton orchestrated it very carefully, that none of his buddies in Rhode Island were going to get into any kind of trouble with the crown.
That's fascinating.
So that I put a chart in my book that sort of shows the timing of this, so you can see it. And so then by December, we get Allen's sermon.
Okay, so what do we know about the Reverend John Allen, Baptist minister at the I think Second Baptist Church in Boston, and he's
so he had a failed ministry in London. He had a little bit of a scandal. He went to the Old Bailey and was charged with forging a £50 note. He was they took a handwriting sample from him, and he was exonerated. He was not found guilty, and the handwriting didn't match, and he was not guilty of that. And the Old Bailey's records are online now. You can actually go see the transcript of, and you can hear John Allen's voice of him defending himself there before. But in any case, he's like, you know what? Now my ministry can't be effective here, even though I was found innocent. He was in a Wilkes neighborhood. John Wilkes, the great parliamentarian, who was very sympathetic to the American cause. So he decides to come to the States, and he comes to Boston to start his ministry over again. And the Sons of Liberty asked him to give a Thanksgiving Day sermon on December 2nd, I believe, around when their church would have celebrated a Thanksgiving. And it wasn't unusual at that time for a Reformed Baptist like Allen to speak about the role of the civil magistrate. You know, what's the biblical role of government? And so it's not that unusual that he would speak on that. And so he gave this sermon. He was invited by the Sons of Liberty to speak. And it was extremely successful sermon, so much so that it got reprinted 7 times. And remember, the American Revolution was a pamphlet war. The American Revolution was fought by pamphlets. And so having a successful pamphlet is huge. There were probably 400 pamphlets published before before independence was declared on July 4th, 1776. And of those 400 pamphlets, John Allen's in the top 10. He's number 6. And so this was widely read. And John Adams, in his law practice, his clerks came back to the practice and told John Adams, they said, you know, even the men who can't read in Boston are having this sermon read to them. So everybody's hearing this, you know, is what they told John.
Why do you think it was so powerful or had such an impact at the time?
Yeah, so no Americans were talking about independence or attacking King George III personally and questioning his motives. And so he was saying things that nobody says again until Thomas Paine's Common Sense. And so Americans aren't talking like this yet. But remember, he's new to the States. He just came over from Britain, lived in a very radical neighborhood in London. And that's where his church had been, on Petticoat Lane there in London. And so
it's interesting. You have these 2 British radicals, Paine and Allen, who come with this idea that, as you said, the Americans are reluctant. Even someone like, Governor Wanton, Darius Sessions,
Right.
others are not embracing this as the moment to declare independence, but instead looking for something else.
Right. And it's these newly imported British radicals who are making these statements, and their pamphlets sell like wildfire.
Oh, yeah.
Well, the other thing that Allen does is he wants to add so it's called an oration on the beauties of liberty, or the essential rights of Americans is the name of his sermon, and also the name of his pamphlet. He puts an addendum on there when he's in Boston that talks about the essential rights of Africans. And he had 7 pages that talks about the essential rights of African slaves. And so he's really an early abolitionist, right? And he's pushing back on this. Nobody in Boston would publish his addendum. So he goes down to Connecticut, and he gets a publisher in Hartford to publish it. And then he goes all the way down to Wilmington, Delaware, and gets another publisher to publish it there. So even though nobody in Boston was willing to publish his addendum about the essential rights of Africans, somebody in Connecticut was, and somebody in Delaware was. So 2 out of those 7 printings got that abolitionist
Interesting
perspective on there.
Yeah. We're talking with Stephen Park, author of The Burning of His Majesty's Schooner Gaspee, an attack on Crown rule before the American Revolution. And do we know what happens to the Reverend John Allen after this?
No. So there's a couple of people who I'm very interested in who kind of disappear from the historical record. One man who took advantage of the chaos of the situation was an enslaved man who lived on Prudence Island in Narragansett Bay named Aaron Biggs. And he took advantage of the situation to escape to the British Navy and escape from his master. And we would look at this as kind of an early escape narrative of a man self-liberating himself by taking advantage of the chaos of the situation and seeing black faces in the British Navy and thinking, oh, look, there's mariners on that vessel who are black like me. Can I serve in the British Navy? So Aaron Biggs, I believe he changed his name. And so it's very hard to follow him. John Allen may have died as early as 1774. He kind of disappears as well. It looks like he went to New Hampshire. He published a couple other less successful pamphlets and a couple of tracts. And then I guess maybe he passed away. He kind of disappears. And so those are the 2 men I'd love to have, if people could find out more about good old Aaron Biggs. He was the only colonial who testified at the time who was willing to name names. And
Is that right?
He had to be discredited, right? And he was in so much danger that Admiral Montague had to come down from Boston and personally escort him from the Beaver to Colony House so he wouldn't be lynched, because he was naming the names of powerful Rhode Island people who were involved in the Gaspee Affair, and putting himself in grave danger.
So Rhode Island, in many ways, was a closed society. That is, you had these merchants who really were running the show for their benefit. And that's just, not to discredit, of course, the whole cause, but you do have that operation in Rhode Island. So, can you tell us a little bit more about Biggs names? There's this commission looking into this, and what does that story look like? I mean, from whatever information Montague or the British Commission are getting, and how would they tell the story of what happened to the Gaspee?
Yeah, so the reason why Aaron Biggs seemed like such a credible witness is what he was telling us matched what really happened, right? And so whether he was coached by mariners on the Beaver and some of the Gaspee mariners, or whether he was actually there, we still don't know to this day. It's kind of, it seems like he was there and he was in the boats, or he could one of the commissioners thought that he had just been very carefully coached. Either way, he exploited the situation to get his freedom, well played, Aaron Biggs, right? He figured out how to, and so but Rhode Island's elites were so concerned about discrediting him, they went and found the enslaved men that he shared quarters with to claim that he was there all night. They said there were no boats on the island that were really seaworthy. There's no way he could have been there. And they went to great efforts to discredit his testimony. Here's an illiterate enslaved man. And so it's, so he's certainly not in a position of power. And so there's a story there to be told as well. I just met with a Brown University student who's writing his senior thesis about Aaron Biggs, and I've read a couple chapters of it. It's excellent.
Oh, good, good.
Yeah.
So he's found out more about what he was doing before.
Yeah, he's digging deeper. Yeah.
Fascinating, fascinating. So there's a lot more we can learn about this story.
I
There's
hope
a lot
so.
of unanswered questions still.
I hope
Good.
so.
Good. So what can you tell us about this commission that does it come here, or where are they doing their investigation?
Yeah, so I did a whole chapter on sort of the history of royal commissions of inquiry, because
Yes.
I didn't know much about it. Americans don't know much about them. It's a research committee. They go back to the 11th century. They go back to William the Conqueror. That this was something that they do in British society. And the reason why Rhode Islanders liked a commission of inquiry is their findings can just be that Dunningston's a bad cop.
Yeah,
They're supposed to be investigating both sides of the story. So like there was a commission of inquiry around Bacon's Rebellion, right? So they're looking at both sides. Is there something the crown is doing wrong here that needs to be fixed? Is there a social problem that needs to be addressed? Are there bad actors involved? And so when you look at their ultimate finding, 1/5 of their final report is just them patting themselves on the back saying, we did a great job. We were very thorough and we were awesome investigators, the 5 people who were on the committee.
Right.
And then 1/5 of the report was just saying that Dunningston was overzealous in his duties and he was kind of a bad cop, So that's 2/5 of the report right there. So they really don't get into trying to name names of Rhode Islanders who were there that night. Some of the names that we have, Bob, are because people put it in their obituary.
Really?
So when they died, they said, I was among the raiders of the Gaspee, and so it isn't until the 1820s that people are actually willing to be in a parade float and admit that they had been part of burning the Gaspee. After the War of 1812 was over, after everything was resolved with Canada and with Britain, then there were a few survivors who lived into the 1820s who were willing to admit that they were there that night. But most people admitted that they were part of the raid in their obituary.
I see. Now, were they, or is this a case of claiming something after the fact?
Yeah, so all we can do is the backwards engineering where we go back and we look at where they lived in 1772. Were they in Providence that night? Did they know the right people? And we're like, you know what? You were at the right place at the right time and you knew the right people. If you claim you were there, you're probably telling the truth. That's about as close as we can get, right? Yeah.
Interesting. Now you mentioned that the Governor Wanton does this, not letting the witnesses and the perpetrators together, and Darius Sessions, Lieutenant Governor, both elected by the voters of Rhode Island, but then each of them remains loyal to the crown, and so that colors in some ways how they're regarded later. But actually, you tell a different story about them and how this choice they're making.
Right. So 2 prominent 19th century historians, Bartlett and Staples, both in their books on this, really give Wanton the benefit of the doubt that he was zealous in carrying out his duties and was really trying to get at the truth. And I push back on that and I say, no, he was really protecting his friends and family. All these folks are interrelated. They've all intermarried and they're all there's no way he was going to see anybody. And this isn't a court. They don't have the power to try anybody. All they can do is make recommendations to the existing court system in Rhode Island. So nobody was going anywhere and nobody was going to be tried with anything. And so, There
was a push, though, to bring some of them to England. I mean, Thomas Hutchinson suggested bringing the perpetrators to England and having them tried there, and that becomes an issue. Should people be...
Right. And I would argue that's some of what they were thinking about doing in April of 75. Not only were they interested in the 4 artillery pieces that were in Concord, Massachusetts, there was also talk of trying to look for Hancock and Adams and one other man. I think there was talk of even rounding up a few of the ringleaders. And that's a very 18th century British model, is you can't take on the whole mob, but what you do is you arrest the ringleaders, make an example of them. And capital punishment was even used that way as well. There were many capital crimes in 18th century England, but very few people were actually ever executed. They just wanted that threat there. Then maybe you would execute a few people to set an example to kind of send a chill through the rest of the crowd.
Right. And then you pardon the rest who then are grateful and supportive. We're talking with Stephen Park, author of The Burning of His Majesty Schooner Gaspee and the Director of Academic Technology at Wheaton College. And there's also this fear then of extradition. I mean, it's mentioned in the committees of correspondence and so on. But I'm also interested in something else that you raise in the book. The fact that the British government doesn't respond in a heavy-handed way. They're not bringing people off. It empowers the rebels in many ways.
Right. And to this day, Bob, I don't know if embolden is a word. I guess I should look it up, right? But embolden should be a word, right?
Yeah.
You know, and so certainly the feeble response here to the Gaspee affair does seem to, now you're giving people license to try to get away with more, right?
Right.
So it's like, if you can actually attack one of His Majesty's schooners that's on station and shoot the commanding officer and get away with it, it does make the London government look very weak, right? And
it does.
And so people have speculated on that for years, whether that really is opening the door for the Boston Tea Party, and that we try something more brazen next time, and we can try something even bolder next time. Sure.
Yeah. What do you think? Should the British government have come down harder? I realize you may not be invited to the next Gaspee Day celebration if you take us
right.
hard line.
Right. Now that I live in Chicago, maybe I'm not worried about it. Right.
That's right. Yeah.
But see, that's a very good question. You know, if you look at the recent book that came out, the Last King of America, the one on that Roberts wrote about King George.
Andrew Roberts. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's talking about the things that an 18th century tyrant should do that George III didn't do. He's like, he wasn't even really a good tyrant by 18th century standards. He should have shut down these newspapers. He should have rounded up these rabble. You know, there are all these things that George could, and some other monarchs in Europe did do those things in the 1770s. And he makes that point. And so they could have had a more heavy-handed response. But then when they did have the heavy-handed response of closing the port of Boston, look at the pushback that they got, right?
That's right.
Yeah, you know, so so a lot of this is counterfactual. We look at the choices people had in front of them, the contingencies of what choices they had in front of them at the time, and of course we have the benefit of 2020 hindsight to know how it played out. But when we try these other options, they're counterfactual. So there's no end to the questions you could ask, right? You know,
right. And I know, as you found, there's a discussion at the time about what the best response should be. It's not as though a unified British government says this is what we'll do. Right.
And like I said, you know, the formula that they followed for trying to arrest Dunningston was not that unusual. It was not that radical. The burning of the Gaspee in some ways wasn't that unusual or that radical. The person who really lit this thing on fire was John Allen. So part of the finding of my book is you don't know as much about John Allen as perhaps you should. And so that's kind of the where I'm pushing back on my book, is he's really my discovery. Is Aaron Biggs is more important than we thought before, because slavery played a bigger role in the American Revolution than we thought before. And now it looks like Biggs really was just an escaped slave. And then the role of the Brown family, the Brown family's role in human trafficking is a bigger story than it used to be. And then, of course, the role of the pulpit in the American Revolution. We've been discovering that for the last 50 years, what an important role the pulpit plays in the American Revolution. I'm giving you John Allen, right? So these are the things that my book adds to the story.
Right. Yeah, we're talking with Stephen Park, author of The Burning of His Majesty Schooner Gaspee. And you write the book, and then you discover all of these other books waiting to be written, stories waiting to be told, which is a great thing. We should talk for a minute about Gaspee Days, which are coming up in Rhode Island. And, so what can you tell us about what goes on? Is it a parade, burning of a ship? They do all kinds of exciting things in Rhode Island.
Yeah. So I went to my first Gaspee Days not until 2005. So I came late to the.
That's when you were finishing your dissertation.
Right. And I was going to the Public Record Office in England to look at the records in the United Kingdom as well. But water fire is amazing. When we've been able to do that, I've seen historical interpreters have come up from Colonial Williamsburg and have done some incredible things. And then, as you said, the 5K race, the parade, all the things that they do, it's amazing.
It really is.
They do some great things there. And so because of that, when I talk to people in Rhode Island, they already have some knowledge of the Gaspee Affair. But then as soon as I leave Rhode Island, people seem to know almost nothing about it,
Yeah.
And so the correlation is extremely high with the Rhode Island border. Yeah. Yeah.
It's really great to remember this event in a way that then gives someone like you and the student at Brown an opportunity really to dig in and find out all the other stories that are part of this. And
yeah, I left 650 footnotes behind. So if you want to know where I got any of my information, there are hundreds of footnotes in my book so you know exactly where I got all this information. So
1772, would you say it's a quiet year, or would you say this is the pivotal year when things begin to change?
Right. This is what woke us up from the lull. And John Adams says as much in his diary. He was saying how he had left politics behind. He's moved on. He's gone back to being a normal attorney. And he's like, the Gaspee Affair was what woke me up and instilled in me a patriot pride. Adams says as much in his diary. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. It's a great story. We've been talking with Stephen Park from Wheaton College, author of The Burning of His Majesty's Schooner Gaspee, and Gaspee Days coming up in early June in Rhode Island. And anything else we should talk about, Steve? It seems like there are many different avenues we could explore as we're talking about this one event that has all of these different connections and pieces to it.
Yeah. I mean, traditionally, people have talked about the right to a trial in the vicinity, to a local trial. And there are many master's degrees that have been written in the 20th century about that very topic by people who are interested in law and jurisprudence. But really, the new area that people are so interested in is, and obviously from the 1619 Project on, is what it was the role of slavery and abolition in the American Revolution. But where by the end of the war, Sir Guy Carleton had 3,000 escaped slaves in New York City. And when George Washington asked for them back, he was told no. And Carleton took them to Nova Scotia and to Jamaica, and they never came back.
Right.
Some went to Africa, to Sierra Leone. And so there's a story there that a new generation of scholars is going to be very interested in the role of race and justice and liberation. And Aaron Biggs is part of that story too.
Yes.
Yeah.
So good. So thank you. We've been talking with Stephen Park from Wheaton College about the burning of His Majesty's Schooner Gaspee in June of 1772. And I want to thank you for joining us, and want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, and our, you are no longer in New England, but you're further afield, and most of our listeners also are further afield. We initially thought we'd have a handful of listeners from around New England, but I want to acknowledge that we've actually had listeners in 65 different countries, 1,600 cities, and just in the past week, folks in Camden, South Carolina, and Camden, New Jersey, DeKalb, Illinois, which is not too far from where you are, Ball Ground, Georgia, Estonia, Norway, Huntington, West Virginia, Nutley, New Jersey, Lima, Peru, and many other points. So I want to thank all of you for joining us, and all those in between, Stephen Park, and many friends of Revolution 250, which is a consortium of 70 plus organizations in Massachusetts looking at ways to commemorate the 250th anniversaries of the American Revolution, one of them being this year with the burning of the Gaspee. So thank you, Stephen Park. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.
Thank you.